In the absolute stillness of a spring dawn, in the year 1623, a single sound sliced through the cool air of Istanbul. It was not the call to prayer echoing from the minarets, nor the gentle lapping of the Bosphorus against the shore. It was a sound that should never have been heard beyond the sacred, silent walls of Topkapi Palace. A piercing cry, sharp as obsidian glass, tore through the marble corridors and across the perfumed courtyards. It was a scream of such profound terror that it seemed to freeze the very dew on the tulip petals in the imperial gardens. It did not belong to a soldier wounded in some distant battle on the plains of Hungary, nor was it the desperate plea of a captured Persian enemy languishing in the dungeons below. No, this was the sound of a young girl, a princess, only 15 years old. Her name was Fatma Sultan, and she was the daughter of the most powerful ruler on the face of the earth, a living shadow of God himself. Her cries were not born of flesh and blood, but of something far deeper, a wound carved directly into the soul. They cut through the ornate tapestries and gilded lattices like icy blades, so raw and so pure in their agony that even the hardened eunuchs who guarded the palace doors, men who had witnessed the silent, brutal politics of the harem their entire lives, recoiled in a primal fear. They stood frozen at their posts, their hands gripping their scimitars, too utterly terrified to intervene in a moment that was forbidden to all mortal eyes, a ritual shrouded in 6 centuries of absolute secrecy. What happened that night within the bride's pavilion was not a simple misfortune, not a family tragedy to be whispered about and then forgotten. It was the unveiling, in blood and terror, of the hidden price that every single daughter of a sultan was forced to pay. A price meticulously carved into both flesh and spirit, a truth so monstrous that the empire's own chroniclers worked for 600 years to silence it, to bury it under layers of golden ink and poetic praise. Fatma's screams did not come from the wounds of a sword or the sting of a whip. They were the cries of a ceremony, an ancient, hallowed practice that shattered the spirit long before it ever touched the body. A system designed to condemn the Ottoman princesses, the daughters of emperors, to a life of hollowed-out shadows even before they reached the cusp of womanhood. For more than 6 centuries, from the moment the Ottoman dynasty first tasted supreme power until its final, gasping breath in 1922, the empire preserved a matrimonial preparation so sinister, so psychologically refined in its cruelty, that not even the fiercest enemies of the throne, not the Habsburgs in Vienna or the Safavids in Persia, would have ever wished it upon their own daughters. This system, this dark art of soul-breaking, was carefully and methodically erased from the official chronicles, scrubbed from the ledgers, hidden behind gilded walls and the silent, knowing smiles of the harem's matriarchs. It was a ghost in the imperial machine, a secret that was never written down, only performed. It resurfaced only recently, a whisper from the grave. Thanks to a cache of private medical notes and coded Persian manuscripts uncovered deep within Istanbul's state archives in 2019, documents that were never meant to see the light of day. For centuries, across the known world, millions of women, from the poorest peasant girl tilling a field in Anatolia, to the noblest ladies in the courts of Europe, even to queens on their own thrones, dreamed of the fate of an Ottoman princess. They imagined a life wrapped in celestial silks from China, adorned with mountains of jewels from India, served by 1,000 hands, their every whim a command. A life of unimaginable luxury and absolute security. But they were dreaming of a gilded cage, and they could never see the horror that lived inside. Behind those glowing walls, behind the veils of mystery and the scent of jasmine, lived not a fairy tale, but a nightmare. A nightmare so unbearable, so profoundly dehumanizing, that many of these young girls, these daughters of supreme power, prayed for a swift and merciful death rather than face the destiny that awaited them on their wedding night. And now, in this telling, you like me will bear witness to a truth that was locked away for 6 centuries. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear is not a fairy tale spun for entertainment. It is a tale of horror disguised as an imperial ceremony, a story of how an empire, in its quest for absolute control, turned its own daughters into the ultimate sacrifice. Before we continue down this dark corridor of history, I ask only one thing of you. If this story has already made your heart tremble, if you feel that cold dread creeping in, then mark your interest with a simple gesture. Subscribe to this channel, and in the comments below, tell us which queen or princess's hidden fate you would like us to reveal next. Would you choose the tragic extravagance of Marie Antoinette, the serpentine power of Cleopatra, or the doomed ambition of Anne Boleyn? Your voice, your curiosity, will guide us to the next secret that history tried so desperately to bury. Now, come with me. Let us pull back the silken curtain and uncover the terrifying reason why so many Ottoman princesses, born into palaces of solid gold, longed for the cold, silent embrace of the grave instead of the gilded destiny of their wedding night. The Ottoman Empire, a dominion as vast and seemingly infinite as a shoreless ocean, spread its shadow for more than 600 years, from the dusty beginnings in 1299 to its final collapse in the ashes of the First World War in 1922. Its armies were a force of nature, their thundering marches echoing across 3 continents, their power a tangible thing felt from the fortified walls of Vienna to the burning, unforgiving deserts of Yemen. After the monumental fall of Constantinople in 1453, a wound from which Christendom would never truly recover, the city was reborn as the beating heart of Ottoman might. Renamed Istanbul, it became the home of Topkapi Palace, the most dazzling and dangerous jewel of imperial power. Within those walls, within the sprawling, labyrinthine complex of marble and gold that was Topkapi, golden chambers and sun-drenched, perfumed courtyards shaped the fates not only of entire kingdoms, but of individual human souls. It was a city within a city, a universe unto itself, and hidden deep behind its veils and its endless, echoing corridors, the imperial harem formed a world entirely of its own. In the popular imagination of the West, the harem was a place of fantasy, a perfumed prison of sensual pleasure. This was a convenient and childish lie. In reality, it was the political epicenter of the empire, a crucible of power as deadly and sophisticated as any royal court in Europe. At the height of its splendor, it held more than 800 women, and it was a universe wrapped in shimmering silk and absolute, watchful silence, where every single breath was observed, every gesture analyzed, and every whispered word could mean either a meteoric rise to unimaginable power or a swift, silent ruin. In the year 1530, when the great Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent broke with centuries of tradition and granted the official title of Haseki Sultan to his wife, the legendary the harem ceased to be merely a place of pleasure and procreation. It became a formal arena of political intrigue, a silent battlefield for alliances and devastating shadow wars fought between women. The concubines, the building blocks of this world, were mostly Christian slaves, girls captured in raids across Europe or bought from the bustling slave markets of North Africa. They entered the gilded gates of the harem with dreams of somehow rising above their station, of exchanging their iron chains for golden ones. Their days were a whirlwind of disciplined education, music, embroidery, poetry, the intricate arts of conversation and dance, and above all, the rituals of absolute, unquestioning obedience. They lived for the single, fleeting hope of winning the Sultan's eye, of being the one chosen to share his bed, for that was the only path to power, the only way to transform from property into a person of influence. Ironically, these young women, torn from their homes, stripped of their names and their faith, and sold like precious wares, often had a twisted form of more freedom, more agency than the Sultan's own daughters. Between the years 1533 and 1656, an era that modern historians now call the Sultanate of Women, female influence within the empire reached its absolute zenith. Women who had entered the palace as slaves, women like the formidable Kozum Sultan and the ruthless Turhan Hatice Sultan, ruled the empire from behind the veil. They became the true power, guiding state councils, deciding the fates of wars, appointing and dismissing grand viziers, and shaping the destiny of the known world with a firm, invisible hand. They were the hidden empresses, the puppet masters of the throne. Yet, while these concubines clawed their way up from nothing to become the shadow rulers of the world, the true princesses, those born of imperial blood, found themselves trapped in a much darker, more insidious labyrinth. They were not players in the game. They were the board itself. They were the most valuable pawns in the empire's grand political chess game. Human coins minted in royal blood, used to seal fragile treaties, to pacify brewing rebellions in distant provinces, or to secure the unwavering loyalty of powerful, ambitious pashas. Their lives were a calculation of state. Their bodies were instruments of diplomacy. It was into this world, this beautiful, merciless machine, that Princess Fatma Sultan was born in the year 1606. She was the daughter of Sultan Ahmed the First and the formidable Kozum Sultan, the very same woman who would one day rule the empire from the shadows with an iron will. Fatma's childhood, by all accounts, was a gilded dream. She wandered through perfumed gardens where nightingales sang. She studied the mysteries of astronomy. She read and translated ancient manuscripts in Arabic and Persian. The scholars of the palace praised her ferocious intelligence. The court chroniclers wrote poems admiring her ethereal beauty. She was, in every sense, a child prodigy. By the age of 14, she had mastered 4 languages. She could pen calligraphy with the elegance and grace of a master poet. And she hungered to unravel the mysteries of the stars with a passion that astonished her tutors. She would sit for hours, debating seasoned scholars in matters of history, law, and geography, her sharp mind cutting through complex arguments with ease. Her brilliance was a light that lit up the entire palace, a source of immense pride for the dynasty. But none of it mattered. Not her intelligence, not her beauty, not her dreams of the cosmos. Her fate, her entire life's trajectory, had been sealed, signed, and delivered before she had taken her first breath. From the very moment she was born, her life was not her own. It belonged to the empire. Her destiny was singular and immutable, to be given in marriage as a token of imperial favor, as a guarantee of loyalty, no matter her own will, no matter the cost to her soul. The man chosen for her was Damat Kara Mustafa Pasha, a hardened, brutal military commander, a man 20 years her senior who had proven his loyalty to the throne in a dozen bloody battles against the Persians. For him, this union was the ultimate prize, a ladder to the highest echelons of power. For her, for the brilliant 15-year-old girl who dreamed of the stars, it was the beginning of a tragedy so profound it would echo for centuries. 3 months before her wedding day, Fatma's life of learning and beauty came to an abrupt and terrifying end. She was thrust into the feared secret process known only in the highest circles of the harem as the Terbiye-i-Mubarak, a name that translates to the sacred education. This ritual, this ceremony of the soul, existed only for princesses of the blood. It was the polished, perfected result of centuries of psychological control, an invisible technology designed with a single purpose: to crush their royal pride, to erase their individual identity, and to mold them into perfect, unthinking instruments of absolute obedience. The woman chosen to oversee Fatma's preparation, her sacred education, was a figure of legendary terror within the harem named Gulnar Hatun. She was a woman of 60 winters, the head of the harem's protocol, a veteran who had personally overseen the training of more than a dozen imperial princesses. Her face was a mask of serene indifference. Her eyes held the cold, detached light of a master artisan who saw the young princess not as a child, but as a block of raw marble to be chiseled into the correct shape. Under Gulnar's ever-watchful eye, Fatma was led away from her familiar chambers and into a secluded part of the palace known as the Gelin Odası, the bride's chamber. This room, though adorned with the finest Persian carpets and inlaid with gleaming ebony panels, was not a sanctuary. It was a prison cell. Every single detail within it was meticulously designed to whisper of duty, submission, and the complete annihilation of self. From the first light of dawn until the midday prayer, Fatma was forced into endless, repetitive rituals of reverence. Her entire physical being was to be re-engineered. She was forced to master 18 different and distinct forms of bowing, each one minutely calibrated for a specific situation. There were postures for greeting her husband, for serving him his food, for lying down in his presence, for simply waiting in absolute silence for his arrival. Her very walk was no longer her own. She was trained in a specific gait known as the yürüyüş-i-sessiz, the silent walk, a series of measured, gliding steps with her head tilted at a precise 30-degree angle, her hands never to be raised above the level of her heart. Every single movement, from the way she sipped her water to the way she sat on a cushion, was stripped of her own personality, of her own innate grace, remaking her into a docile, living shadow, a beautiful automaton. But the cruelest torment, the most refined instrument of her psychological dismantling, was the control of her speech. Her vast and brilliant vocabulary, once filled with the language of poets and astronomers, was systematically reduced to just 43 approved words. 43. These were expressions of gratitude, of acceptance, of humble requests, or of sincere apologies. Any deviation from this approved lexicon, any accidental spark of independent thought or intellectual curiosity, was punished with a severity that was as swift as it was silent. Days of forced fasting, long hours of solitary confinement in a darkened room, or the ultimate weapon, public humiliation before the entire assembly of the harem, where she would be shamed for her pride and her willfulness. Her obedience was not merely trained, it was tested. Periodically, she was brought before a tribunal of senior women and eunuchs, presided over by none other than her own mother, the powerful Kosum Sultan. There, in the cold, judging silence of the chamber, her mother looked upon her not as a beloved child, but as a strategic asset, a coin in the empire's vast marketplace of power. She judged her daughter's progress with a detached, clinical precision, her gaze offering no maternal comfort, only the cold assessment of a stateswoman evaluating a tool of the state. And still, even after all this, the most disturbing, the most profoundly violating part of her preparation awaited her. Deep beneath the palace, in the cool, damp earth, a series of secret, windowless chambers had been built. They were exact replicas of the bridal rooms, used for the consummation of royal marriages. There, in the flickering torchlight, Fatma was forced to face the ordeal known as the Talamai Gerdek, the rehearsals of the first night. In these terrifying, silent rooms, she was forced to interact with a series of life-sized wax mannequins, anatomical figures of men, crafted with terrifying precision by Venetian artisans, their cold, glass eyes staring into nothing. Stern, emotionless instructors, women who were masters of this dark art, commanded her from the shadows, their voices calm, and even as they ordered her to perform gestures and acts that no girl of her age, no human being, should ever have to learn in such a cold and clinical manner. Every single reaction, her natural revulsion, her tears of shame, her desperate pleas to stop, her instinctive physical resistance, her paralyzing fear, was meticulously observed and written down in secret ledgers. These were not the actions of a bride preparing for marriage. They were the responses of a subject in a horrifying psychological experiment. The more she resisted, the more her spirit fought back against the violation, the harsher her conditioning became. The fasts grew longer, the humiliations more severe, the rehearsals more frequent and more explicit. Slowly, painfully, day by day, the brilliant girl who had once dreamed of mapping the stars was being broken into silence. Her intellectual light, once so dazzling, was dimmed until it was barely a flicker. Her body was trained to obey commands without thought. Her spirit was bent and reshaped until it learned the singular lesson of absolute, unquestioning submission. Princess Fatma was no longer the daughter of emperors, a prodigy of the court. She was now an apprentice to her own tragic fate, a sacrifice being meticulously prepared for the altar of the empire. A week before the wedding, the psychological regime grew even harsher, more intense. Fatma Sultan was transferred from the bride's chamber to an even more isolated location, a small, solitary building within the palace grounds known as the Gelin Köşkü, the bride's pavilion. This chamber was an architectural masterpiece of control, a gilded sensory deprivation tank. It was constructed with thick, soundproofed walls, ensuring that no sound from the outside world, not the birdsong from the gardens, not the distant bustle of the city, not even the comforting call to prayer, could penetrate its suffocating silence. Here, in this sealed world, every single aspect of her existence was controlled with the precision of an alchemist. What she ate was not a meal, but a prescription. A strict diet of pomegranates, honey, almonds, and goat's milk, foods believed to enhance fertility and docility. Spices from the distant shores of Yemen were mixed into her food, not for flavor, but for their subtle, mind-altering properties. Even the way she bathed was no longer a simple act of hygiene, but a regulated daily ritual. Each day, silent attendants performed a series of purification baths, using oils scented with valerian, poppy, and orange blossom. These elixirs, prepared by palace physicians trained in the esoteric arts of Cordoba and Samarkand, contained secret, unrecorded substances. Some were powerful sedatives designed to calm the body and quiet a racing heart. Others were meant to dull the will, to induce a state of passive compliance. And a few, the most potent, were known to induce a strange and unsettling sense of dissociation, a feeling of drifting away from one's own self, of observing one's own life from a great, untouchable distance. The very walls of the pavilion were turned into instruments of her conditioning. They were draped with enormous, elaborate tapestries, not depicting scenes of nature or mythology, but embroidered with idealized images of famous wives from Islamic history, women celebrated for being obedient, fertile, and utterly submissive to their husbands. Each thread was a lesson, each image a promise of the eternal rewards that awaited her for her complete and total loyalty. And if that constant, silent indoctrination wasn't enough, there was the matter of the mirrors. Venetian mirrors, polished to a flawless sheen, were strategically placed throughout the small pavilion, angled in such a way that Fatma could not escape her own reflection. No matter where she sat or stood, she was forced to observe herself constantly. This practice, known as muraqabah, was a twisted appropriation of a Sufi mystical exercise of self-reflection. In its original spiritual context, it was a tool for knowing oneself, for connecting with the divine within. But here, in this prison of silk and mirrors, it became a psychological weapon of terrifying efficiency. She was made to police herself, to become her own jailer, to watch and judge even her most private thoughts and her most fleeting facial expressions. In this silent, isolated world of prescribed foods, mind-altering baths, and constant self-surveillance, Fatma began to realize the full, horrifying truth of her situation. She no longer belonged to herself. She had been deconstructed and reassembled. Her body, her voice, her very mind had been molded piece by piece into an instrument of obedience, a beautiful, silent object to be presented to her future husband. The preparation had achieved its ultimate, sinister purpose, not only breaking her will, but erasing the very essence of the girl who had once dreamed of the stars. The appointed day finally arrived. March 15th, 1623. From the moment the sun rose over the hills of Asia, the city of Istanbul throbbed like an overflowing heart. The streets, normally a chaotic symphony of commerce and life, were transformed into a river of celebration, filled with grand processions, the thunder of drums, and the sweet, heavy scent of incense. Inside the sprawling courtyards of Topkapi Palace, magnificent banquets were laid out on tables of solid gold. Dancers from Persia and Andalusia twirled in clouds of silk. Musicians sang epic poems celebrating the empire's glory. And the elite Janissary soldiers, the Sultan's personal guard, displayed their fearsome strength and martial prowess before the Sultan's approving eyes. For the people of the empire, it was a vision of paradise on earth, a dazzling display of the dynasty's wealth and power. For Princess Fatma, it was the prelude to a death sentence. The official chroniclers of the court, in their flowing poetic prose, wrote that while the hundreds of guests laughed and feasted, Princess Fatma sat in a state of absolute, unnerving silence, her lips dry and colorless, her gaze empty and fixed on a point beyond the material world. The palace doctors, in their private coded notes that were never meant to be seen by outsiders, recorded what we would today recognize as a series of severe panic attacks. They noted uncontrollable trembling, a cold sweat that drenched her silk garments despite the cool March air, a complete and total loss of appetite, and periods of shallow, rapid breathing so severe that they genuinely feared for her life. The public spectacle glowed with a blinding splendor, but inside the fragile 15-year-old princess, a profound and unstoppable terror was growing like a spreading internal shadow, consuming everything in its path. As night fell and the final cup of wine was raised, when the civilian guests had departed and a hush fell over the palace, the most dreaded procession of all began. Fatma, adorned in her heavy bridal attire, was escorted to the nuptial pavilion. This was not just any room. It was a special detached building set within the palace's private gardens, a structure designed from architectural plans that dated back to the time of Mehmed the Conqueror himself. It was octagonal in shape, rising in 3 distinct levels, each with its own terrifying symbolic purpose: purification, submission, and final consummation. The architecture was no accident. Every corridor was designed to be narrow, every chamber built to feel enclosed, every detail intended to reinforce her sense of vulnerability, to turn the ceremony not into a union of 2 people, but into a total, unconditional act of surrender. It was a machine built for the sole purpose of finalizing the destruction of a human soul. The first level of the octagonal pavilion, the ground floor, was known as the Tajib Katu, the chamber of adornment and purification. Here, in a room of cool white marble, Fatma was subjected to hours of final ritual baths. Enormous marble tubs were filled with rose water and the essences of sandalwood and precious ambergris from the distant shores of Somalia. This was not about cleansing the body, but about preparing the mind. Alchemists, their faces hidden in the steam-filled air, applied a series of ointments to her skin. These were not cosmetics. They were complex formulas mixed with diluted opium, mandrake root extract, and other secret compounds designed to induce a state of profound calm, of dreamlike compliance, even a bizarre sense of euphoric detachment. The palace doctors, observing from a hidden alcove, described her state in their clinical notes as one of a misafir rüyası, a visitor's trance, a condition where the body yields and follows commands while the soul, the conscious self, screams in absolute, unreachable silence. From there, she was led up a narrow, winding staircase to the second level, the Teslim Kata, the floor of surrender. It was here that Fatma was dressed in her final bridal attire. It was a gown of pure white silk, so heavily embroidered with gold thread and pearls from the Persian Gulf that it weighed almost as much as she did. At first glance, it was a garment of breathtaking majesty, a symbol of her imperial status. But it was also, in its very design, a cage. Hidden within its layers were a series of cleverly designed cords and clasps, making it easier for attendants to restrain her if she resisted. The crown, a magnificent creation of diamonds and rubies, was deliberately made to be incredibly heavy, forcing her head and neck into a posture of submission. The golden anklets and bracelets she wore were not just jewelry. They were beautiful shackles, restricting her movement. Even her shoes, with their thick and flexible soles, were designed to slow her steps, to prevent any sudden flight. The entire dress was a prison sewn from luxury, an instrument of control disguised as a work of art. While Fatma was being transformed into this living symbol of obedience, her future husband, the battle-hardened Kara Mustafa Pasha, was undergoing his own, very different kind of preparation. Surrounded by his most trusted counselors and seasoned warriors, men who understood the brutal mechanics of power, he was not being taught about love or partnership. He was being instructed, with cold, strategic precision, on how to psychologically impose himself upon a princess of imperial blood. He was taught methods of verbal intimidation, specific phrases designed to humiliate and assert dominance. He was schooled in techniques of physical control, how to use his size and strength to project an aura of absolute, unchallengeable authority. Every single detail of the coming night was planned and rehearsed to ensure that there would be no space for doubt, no room for resistance, no possibility of her royal status, giving her a shred of power in that final intimate encounter. Finally, her preparation complete, Fatma was led up the last flight of stairs to the third and final level, the Zifaf Kata, the Chamber of Consummation. This was the sanctum sanctorum of the ritual. Its walls were not draped in soft, romantic silks. They were covered with enormous, imposing tapestries depicting the great military triumphs of the Ottoman dynasty. There were scenes of conquered cities burning, of defeated armies kneeling in surrender, of captive foreign princesses being presented as spoils of war. This imagery was deliberate, a brutal and direct message. It drew a straight, unbroken line between victory on the battlefield and the act of victory that was to take place in the marriage bed. The very furniture in the room was built for control. The bed was fitted with hidden cords. The cushions were soaked in the same calming, will-dulling oils used in her baths. The lighting, from dozens of flickering candles, was arranged to cast deep, disorienting shadows, softening any potential for resistance. It was here, in this chamber drenched in the symbols of domination and conquest, in this theater of absolute power, that the 15-year-old Princess Fatma, her mind and body saturated with drugs, her will systematically dismantled over 3 months of relentless conditioning, faced the final dreaded act of her wedding night. When the heavy, soundproof doors of the Zifaf Kata finally closed behind the procession, sealing the chamber in an unnerving silence, Fatma was left completely alone with her husband. The medical records from that time, the secret notes written by the observing physicians, describe what happened next, not as a consummation, but as a total and catastrophic collapse of the human spirit. The girl who had endured months of discipline, humiliation, and psychological torment could no longer process reality. She could not respond coherently. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a violent, ceaseless shuddering. Her voice, when she tried to speak, dwindled to a faint, incoherent murmur. Her eyes, once so bright with intelligence, now wandered aimlessly around the room, as if gazing into a distant private world far away, a place where no one could reach her. The imperial doctors had a clinical chilling term for this state. They called it sakat olma, the complete shock, or the great falling. Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man seasoned in the brutality of war and the conquest of nations, believed at first that this was a final, defiant act of royal arrogance, a form of silent resistance that needed to be broken. He applied the techniques that his counselors had taught him, the words of intimidation, the gestures of dominance, the calculated, assertive physical contact. But what he encountered was not resistance. It was absence. There was no struggle to overcome, no will to break, because there was nothing left. There was only a void. In a desperate, final act of self-preservation, Fatma's mind had fled. It had retreated into a deep, profound state of dissociation, as though her soul had literally untethered itself from her body in order to survive the unsurvivable. It was the spirit's final, desperate escape. When the consummation finally occurred, after hours of what the observers chillingly described as failed attempts, it was recorded in coded Persian documents as a profoundly traumatic event for both of them. The physician's notes speak of internal bleeding, of repeated fainting spells, and use a terrifyingly poetic phrase to describe Fatma's state. Ruh Göçmek, the departure of the soul. From that single, catastrophic night onward, Fatma Sultan was never the same person again. In the days and weeks that followed, her behavior alarmed even the most hardened and unsympathetic instructors of the harem, the very women who had engineered her transformation. She developed a severe case of selective mutism, speaking only in faint, terrified whispers, and only when addressed directly by a figure of absolute authority. Her appetite, once healthy and vibrant, vanished completely, forcing her attendants to feed her by hand like an infant, lest she waste away entirely. Without any apparent trigger, she would break into long, inconsolable hours of uncontrollable weeping, a deep, guttural sobbing that seemed to come from a place of unbearable, unreachable pain. But worst of all, she developed what the court chroniclers, with their limited understanding of the human mind, called the sickness of fear. The mere presence of any man, even the trusted, castrated eunuchs who had guarded her since childhood, was enough to throw her into a state of absolute panic. Rapid, gasping breaths, profuse sweating, and fainting spells became a daily reality. The palace physicians, desperate to give her condition a name, diagnosed her with what they termed virginal melancholy, a condition they disturbingly considered to be common, even expected, among high-born princesses after their wedding night. In our modern vocabulary, we would call it what it was: irreversible, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, an unhealable wound carved deep into her soul. They tried every remedy available to them. They prescribed calming herbs and tonics. They brought in musicians to play soothing melodies. They even summoned Sufi mystics to perform spiritual exercises, hoping to coax her soul back into her body. But nothing worked. None of it could restore the vitality that had been so systematically extinguished. The brilliant, curious girl who had once debated scholars, the child prodigy who had adored astronomy and poetry, was gone forever. In her place remained a dim, vacant shadow of a human being, obedient, silent, and lifeless. Her beloved books gathered dust in her chambers. Her astronomical instruments lay untouched, their brass surfaces tarnishing with time. The gardens where she had once walked with such joy and curiosity grew silent, her absence a palpable presence. The daughter of the most powerful sultan on earth, the jewel of the Ottoman dynasty, had become a ghost of what she might have been. Her marriage to Kara Mustafa Pasha became a hollow, mechanical arrangement. There were children born out of duty. There were public ceremonies where she appeared as a beautiful, silent doll. There were all the outward appearances of a normal royal life. But behind the closed doors of their palace, there was only a vast, echoing silence and an unbridgeable distance. Mustafa himself, as suggested in his later private memoirs, sought refuge from the memory of that night in endless military campaigns and, eventually, in the dull, forgiving haze of opium, desperately trying to drown the guilt of having been the final, brutal instrument of a ritual that had so completely and utterly destroyed her. Fatma lived for 29 more years in this hollowed-out state. She became a figure of pure ceremony, a mother by dynastic duty, a wife without a voice, a princess without a soul. In the year 1652, she finally died at the age of 46. The official court records, ever mindful of the empire's image, list her cause of death as a simple brain fever. But the date of her death fell on the precise anniversary of her wedding. To those few in the court who knew the truth, who remembered the vibrant girl she had once been, it was no coincidence. On that day, the crushing weight of memory finally closed in upon her soul, granting her the only escape she had left. The devastating tragedy of Fatma Sultan was not an isolated case. It was not a singular horror. It was a mirror, a single horrifying reflection of a pattern that was repeated through generations of Ottoman princesses. Palace medical records and private letters, unearthed and deciphered centuries later, have revealed that dozens of other royal daughters endured the same sinister fate. Some were left scarred by the same profound mutism. Others tried to escape their arranged fates through feigned madness, or, when that failed, through suicide. And a few, the most unfortunate, simply vanished from the chronicles altogether, their names and lives erased as if they had never existed at all. The great machinery of the empire, so precise in its protocols of power, also knew how to efficiently erase its inconvenient traces. What could not be erased was dressed in the soft language of euphemism, softened into words of ceremony, or hidden behind the ornate, emotionless phrases in the official records. But the truth, as it always does, had left its scars. It survived in secret writings, in encoded documents, in the whispered testimonies of harem servants that were passed down through generations, pulsing in the shadows until modern times finally brought them to light. And some of these princesses, despite their brutal conditioning, tried to resist. Records translated only recently speak of royal daughters who faked their own deaths to avoid a second or third political marriage. Others created secret coded languages to communicate with their sisters, who had been silenced and broken by the very same rituals. And a few, with an unimaginable courage that defies belief, petitioned the Sultan directly for divorce, challenging a system that was thought to be as unbreakable and as divinely ordained as the heavens themselves. These stories, buried for centuries in forbidden archives, remind us that even in the deepest, most suffocating darkness, sparks of human resistance can survive. Women who were raised from birth to surrender still found ways to whisper no into the suffocating silence.